This episode contains discussions of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. Peter Sutcliffe had finally been identified. For years he had existed as an unknown figure moving through one of the largest murder investigations in British history. Detectives searched for him. Journalists wrote about him. Communities feared him. Yet despite the scale of the inquiry, he remained frustratingly out of reach. Now that uncertainty was over. His name was known. His face was known. The search that had dominated years of investigation had finally reached its conclusion. Yet for many people, the arrest did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something else. Because finding Peter Sutcliffe and holding Peter Sutcliffe accountable were two very different things. For years, the investigation had focused on one question: who was responsible? Now a new question was beginning to emerge. What would justice look like? For the families who had lost loved ones, for the women who had survived attacks, for the detectives who had devoted years of their lives to the inquiry, and for a public that had lived alongside fear for so long, the next chapter carried its own weight. The mystery of the offender had been resolved. The process of judgment was only just beginning. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles. Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 15, Judgment. In the days following Peter Sutcliffe's arrest, the focus of the investigation began to change. For years, detectives had devoted their energy to identifying the man responsible for the attacks. Every lead, every interview, and every public appeal had been directed towards the same objective. The challenge had been finding him. Now the challenge was proving it. And that distinction matters. An arrest is not a conclusion, it is a beginning. However certain investigators may feel, evidence must still be gathered, examined, and presented. Questions must still be answered. Allegations must still be supported by facts capable of withstanding scrutiny. For detectives involved in the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, that process represented the culmination of years of work. Yet it also carried a different kind of pressure. Finding Peter Sutcliffe had been difficult. Building the case against him would be equally demanding. As investigators examined the evidence, they were no longer looking for a suspect. They were searching for connections. They were looking for proof. They were looking for a way to demonstrate clearly and conclusively how one man could be linked to years of violence that had left such a profound impact upon communities across northern England. The scale of that task should not be underestimated. By this stage, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had generated enormous amounts of information. Witness statements filled files. Physical evidence required examination, Previous inquiries needed to be reviewed. Investigators found themselves looking backwards across years of work while simultaneously preparing for the legal process that lay ahead. For the public, the arrest often appeared to create certainty. For detectives, it created responsibility. Every decision would now face scrutiny. Every piece of evidence would be examined. Every conclusion would need to withstand challenge. The investigation had spent years searching for answers. Now it had to demonstrate that those answers were correct. At the centre of that process sat Peter Sutcliffe himself. For years he had existed only as an unknown figure, a possibility hidden amongst thousands of names, a man whose identity remained frustratingly out of reach. Now he was no longer a theory, no longer a suspect hidden within paperwork, no longer a face imagined through witness descriptions. He was real. And for the first time, investigators were able to examine not only the evidence surrounding him, but the man himself. That process would reveal details that were both illuminating and deeply unsettling. Because, as detectives continued building their case, they found themselves confronting a question that extended beyond the crimes alone. Who was Peter Sutcliffe? And how had he managed to conceal so much for so long? For years, Peter Sutcliffe had existed almost entirely through his actions. Detectives knew the devastation left behind. They knew the locations. They knew the timelines. They knew the patterns investigators had spent years attempting to understand. Yet despite everything the inquiry had uncovered, the man at the centre of it all remained strangely distant. Now that distance had disappeared. For the first time, investigators were no longer attempting to imagine the person responsible. They were sitting across from him. That reality carries a weight of its own. The Yorkshire Ripper had occupied a unique place within the public imagination for years. Newspaper headlines had transformed him into a figure that often seemed larger than life. Fear had amplified his presence. The scale of the investigation had amplified his presence. The uncertainty surrounding his identity had amplified his presence. Yet the man now sitting in custody was not a myth. He was not a symbol. He was not a headline. He was a person. There is something striking about moments like this in major investigations, I find. After years of searching for an unknown offender, the detectives are suddenly confronted by the reality that the individual they have spent so long pursuing is in many respects entirely ordinary. Peter Sutcliffe did not look like the monster many people had imagined. He did not seem to resemble the larger-than-life figure that had emerged through years of media reporting and public fear. Instead, investigators found themselves looking at a man who, on the surface, appeared remarkably unremarkable. That contrast can be deeply unsettling. Human beings often prefer a clear distinction between ordinary people and those who commit extraordinary acts of violence. It is a comforting way of understanding the world. If dangerous individuals appear obviously different, then danger itself feels easier to recognize. Reality rarely offers that comfort. Again and again throughout history, serious offenders have been described in similar ways. Neighbours express surprise. Colleagues express disbelief. Friends struggle to reconcile what they believed they knew with what has been revealed. The difficulty is not necessarily that people are dishonest. The difficulty is that human beings are complicated, complex creatures. For investigators building the case against Peter Sutcliffe, that complexity now sat directly in front of them. The mystery surrounding his identity had finally been resolved. The challenge of understanding him, well, that was only just beginning. There is a strange transition that occurs in major investigations once an offender has been identified. For years, attention is directed towards absence. Investigators search for something they cannot quite reach. Questions dominate conversations. Possibilities multiply. Every new lead carries the potential to change everything. And then suddenly, the search ends. The uncertainty that once defined the investigation begins to recede. Yet certainty does not arrive all at once. Instead, it emerges gradually through conversations, interviews, and evidence. Piece by piece, detectives begin constructing a clearer understanding, not only of what happened, but of the individual responsible. And that process was now unfolding within the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. For years, Peter Sutcliffe had existed as a theory. Now, he was a person. A man who could answer questions. A man who could offer explanations. A man who, for the first time, could be examined not through witness statements or investigative assumptions, but directly. What investigators discovered was not always straightforward. Human beings often imagine that once an offender has been identified, understanding naturally follows. The reality is rarely so simple. Knowing who somebody is does not automatically explain why they acted as they did. It does not reveal how they understood themselves. Nor does it answer the countless questions left behind by years of violence. If anything, those questions often become much more complicated. For detectives, the challenge was no longer locating Peter Sutcliffe. The challenge was making sense of him. That task carried its own difficulties. Because serious offenders rarely arrive with neat explanations attached to them. Their actions exist within a web of choices, beliefs, experiences, and justifications that can be difficult to untangle. Sometimes those explanations appear self-serving. Sometimes they appear contradictory. And sometimes they seem to shift over time. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation would prove no different. As interviews continued and evidence accumulated, investigators found themselves confronted by a man whose explanations would become almost as controversial as the crimes themselves. That controversy would eventually extend far beyond the interview room. It would shape public discussion. It would influence legal proceedings. And it would raise difficult questions about responsibility, accountability, and the stories people tell themselves about their own actions. For now, however, those debates still lay ahead. The immediate task remained the same. Listen carefully. Examine the evidence. And begin the difficult process of separating explanation from excuse. As investigators continued speaking with Peter Sutcliffe, they found themselves confronting a reality that often emerges in cases involving serious violence. The facts of an event and the way people explain an event are not always the same thing. That distinction would become increasingly important in the weeks and months that followed. Most people like to imagine that responsibility is straightforward. A person commits an act, evidence establishes what happened. Accountability follows. Whilst that process may sound simple in theory, reality is often far more complicated. Human beings are natural storytellers. We explain ourselves constantly. We explain our decisions. We explain our mistakes. We explain our successes. And when confronted with actions that are difficult to justify, people often search for explanations capable of making those actions feel understandable, both to others and to themselves. That tendency is not unique to offenders alone. It is part of being human. The difference, of course, is that in cases involving serious violence, those explanations carry enormous significance. As Peter Sutcliffe began offering his own account of events, investigators were not simply listening to what he said. They were evaluating it, comparing it against evidence, comparing it against known facts, comparing it against years of investigative work. That process would prove essential, because explanations can serve many purposes. Sometimes they reveal understanding. Sometimes they reveal belief. Sometimes they reveal how an individual wishes to be seen. And sometimes they reveal very, very little at all. For detectives, the challenge was not deciding whether Peter Sutcliffe had explanations for his actions. The challenge was determining what those explanations actually meant. Were they genuine reflections of his thinking? Were they attempts to rationalise behaviour after the fact? Were they efforts to reduce responsibility? Or were they something else entirely? These questions would become increasingly important as the case moved towards its next stage, because the legal process that lay ahead would require more than evidence alone. It would require society to confront a deeper question, not simply what Peter Sutcliffe had done, but how those actions should be understood. That distinction may appear subtle. In reality, it would shape some of the most controversial discussions surrounding the case. And the closer people examined those discussions, the clearer it became that the search for accountability was only just beginning. The closer investigators examined Peter Sutcliffe's explanations, the more apparent it became that the case was moving towards a difficult crossroads. On one side sat the evidence. Years of investigation, years of violence, years of grief carried by families, survivors, and communities whose lives had been permanently altered. On the other sat the explanations being offered by the man responsible. Those two things did not always sit comfortably alongside one another. That tension would become one of the defining features of what followed. Because accountability is rarely concerned only with what happened. It is also concerned with how society understands what happened. When people commit acts of extraordinary violence, there is often a powerful desire to find an explanation capable of making sense of them. Human beings are uncomfortable with chaos. We search for reasons. We search for causes. We search for narratives that transform something frightening into something understandable. Sometimes those explanations help. Sometimes they complicate matters further. As discussions surrounding Peter Sutcliffe continued, questions began emerging that extended beyond the investigation itself. They touched upon responsibility, culpability, and the difficult relationship between explanation and accountability. Can understanding behaviour explain it? Can explaining behaviour excuse it? And where should society draw the line between the two? These are not questions unique to the Yorkshire Ripper case. They emerge whenever serious harm occurs. Yet they carried particular weight here because the consequences were so profound. Behind every discussion sat real people whose lives had been irrevocably changed. Families who had had to bury their loved ones. Survivors who bravely continued carrying the impact of the violence done to them. Communities that had lived beneath years of fear. Against that backdrop, abstract debates suddenly become deeply personal. The closer the case moved towards judgment, the clearer it became that this was not simply about determining what Peter Sutcliffe had done. That had already been established. The challenge now was deciding how those actions should be understood. And as history would show, not everybody would agree on that answer. There is a tendency when looking back at major criminal cases to assume that judgment arrives as a single moment. A verdict is delivered. A sentence is imposed. The story reaches its natural conclusion. Reality is rarely that simple. In truth, judgment often begins long before anybody enters a courtroom. It begins in conversations, in newspaper headlines, in living rooms, in police stations. In the quiet moments where people attempt to make sense of events that seem almost impossible to comprehend. By the time Peter Sutcliffe's case moved towards the court, many people had already formed opinions about him. Some saw a heinous monster. Others searched for explanations. Many simply struggled to reconcile the scale of the violence with the image of the man now sitting in custody. And that struggle is understandable. Human beings often find it easier to understand individual acts than sustained patterns of harm. A single event can be shocking. Years of violence require people to confront something much more unsettling. They require people to accept that extraordinary harm can emerge from an individual who on the surface may appear entirely ordinary. That reality challenges comforting assumptions. It challenges the belief that danger is always obvious. It challenges the belief that serious offenders are somehow separate from the rest of society. And it challenges the belief that understanding a person automatically means understanding their actions. For many people following the Yorkshire Ripper case, those tensions were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The evidence was building. The investigation was progressing. The legal process was moving forward. Yet beneath all of that sat a deeper question. What would justice actually mean? Would it mean punishment? Would it mean answers? Would it mean closure? Or would it simply mark another stage in a story whose consequences would continue long after the courtroom had emptied? These questions had no easy answers. They never do. Yet they would shape everything that followed as the case moved steadily towards its next chapter. As the case continued moving towards the courts, the passage of time began to acquire a different significance. For years, time had been measured by attacks, investigations, and unanswered questions. Each development had been viewed through the lens of uncertainty. People waited for news. Detectives waited for breakthroughs. Families waited for answers. Now, for the first time in a very long while, there appeared to be a direction. The uncertainty surrounding the offender's identity had ended. Yet the passage of time still carries its own weight. Because whilst investigations move forward, grief does not always follow the same path. That is something criminal justice systems often struggle to capture. Court proceedings are designed to establish the facts, assess the evidence, and determine responsibility. They are not designed to heal loss. They are not designed to restore the years that have been taken from people. And they cannot return those who are gone. For the families connected to the Yorkshire Ripper case, these realities existed side by side. There was relief that the man responsible had been identified. There was relief that the attacks had stopped. Yet relief and grief are not opposites. Human beings are capable of carrying both at the same time. The ending of uncertainty does not automatically end sorrow. In some cases, it can even intensify it. When an offender remains unknown, attention often focuses upon the search itself. People wait for answers. They hope for progress. They direct their energy toward the future. Once that offender has been identified, the focus inevitably shifts. Attention returns to what has been lost. Attention returns to the people whose lives were interrupted, altered, or ended. Attention returns to the reality that even the most successful investigation cannot undo what has already happened. And that truth can be difficult to sit with. Perhaps that is why discussions about justice are often so emotionally complicated. People want accountability. People want answers. People want consequences. Yet beneath all of those desires often lies something much simpler. People want the harm not to have happened at all. And that is the one thing no investigation, no court, and no sentence can ever provide. As the Yorkshire Ripper case moved closer towards judgment, that reality remained quietly present beneath everything else. The legal process would continue. The evidence would be examined. Decisions would be made. But for many people, the story had never truly been about Peter Sutcliffe. It had always been about those whose lives had been changed by him. And it was their absence that continued to give the case its weight. One of the risks in any major criminal case is that the scale of the investigation can begin to overshadow the people at its centre. Files grow thicker, evidence accumulates, legal proceedings advance. Discussions become focused upon suspects, detectives, mistakes, and outcomes. Gradually, attention can drift away from those individuals whose lives made the investigation necessary in the first place. The Yorkshire Ripper case was no exception. By the time Peter Sutcliffe had been identified, years had passed since some of the earlier attacks. Entire chapters of life had unfolded in the space between those events and the moment of his arrest. Children had grown older. Families had learned to navigate grief. Communities had adapted to absences that should never have existed. Yet the passage of time did not diminish the significance of what had been lost. If anything, it highlighted it. Because behind every discussion about evidence or accountability sat lives that had once been lived in full. Lives that extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Women with friendships. Women with families. Women with ambitions, routines, and ordinary moments that rarely appear in official records. It is often easier for history to remember the manner of a person's death than the fullness of their life. That imbalance is understandable. Crime creates documentation. Life often does not. Yet if we are not careful, the result can be a story in which offenders become the most visible figures, whilst those they harmed gradually fade into the background. The families connected to the Yorkshire Ripper case spent years resisting that possibility. Again and again, they reminded people that their loved ones were more than victims, more than names in newspaper articles, more than evidence presented in court. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, people whose absence left spaces that could never truly be filled. As the case moved closer towards judgment, those realities remained unchanged. The legal process might establish responsibility. It might deliver accountability. It might answer certain questions, but it could never restore what had been taken. That heartbreaking truth sat quietly beneath every discussion surrounding the case. And perhaps it is that heartbreaking truth which explains why justice can feel both profoundly important and profoundly incomplete at the same time. Because whilst a court can judge actions, they cannot erase consequences. They cannot return lost years, and they cannot give families back the people that they loved. The closer the Yorkshire Ripper case moved towards its next chapter, the more impossible it became to ignore that reality. There is a common assumption that criminal cases end when a verdict is delivered. The courtroom reaches a decision. The sentence is announced. The legal process concludes. From a procedural perspective, that is often true. From a human perspective, things are rarely so straightforward. One of the most difficult realities surrounding serious crime is that legal endings and emotional endings do not always arrive together. Courts can determine responsibility. They can impose consequences. They can establish facts. Yet the experiences carried by the survivors, families, and communities continued long after legal proceedings have finished. The Yorkshire Ripper case illustrates this reality with particular clarity. By the time Peter Sutcliffe moved towards judgment, years had already passed since some of the attacks. Families had spent those years living with uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions. Their lives had continued moving forward because life demands movement. Yet that movement existed alongside losses that could never be fully resolved. It is easy to imagine that identifying an offender automatically brings closure. The reality is often more complicated. Answers can be important. Accountability can be important. Justice can be important. Yet none of those things remove absence. None of them restore lost futures. And none of them allow people to return to the lives they once expected to have. That is not a failure of the justice system. It is simply an acknowledgement of its limits. Courts are designed to determine responsibility. They are not designed to heal grief. As the Yorkshire Ripper case continued towards its next stage, these realities existed side by side. There was relief that the uncertainty surrounding the offender had ended. There was relief that the violence had stopped. Yet alongside that relief remained something quieter and far more enduring. Loss. Not dramatic loss. Not the kind that exists only in headlines. The ordinary, everyday loss that follows people into birthdays, anniversaries, family gatherings, and quiet moments years after public attention has moved elsewhere. Perhaps that is one of the reasons that cases like this continue to resonate long after they leave the front page. Because whilst investigations eventually end, the lives shaped by those investigations continue. The legal process was moving steadily towards judgment. For many families, however, the challenge had never been reaching the end of a court case. The challenge was learning how to live beyond it. Yet despite its limitations, justice remains profoundly important. That may seem like a contradiction. If courts cannot heal grief, restore lost futures, or erase suffering, then what purpose do they serve? The answer lies partly in recognition. Serious harm does more than cause injury. It disrupts the way people understand the world around them. It creates a sense of disorder. Something that should not have happened has happened. Something that cannot be undone has become part of reality. In those moments, accountability becomes more than a legal process. It becomes a public acknowledgement of truth, a recognition that harm occurred, a recognition that responsibility exists, and a recognition that what happened matters. For many families affected by the Yorkshire Ripper case, these recognitions carried enormous significance. The years preceding Peter Sutcliffe's arrest had been filled with uncertainty. Investigations continued. Public appeals continued. Speculation continued. Questions often outnumbered answers. Now, for the first time, there was a possibility that some of those questions might finally be addressed. Not all of them, perhaps not even most of them, but some. That distinction is important because justice is often expected to provide things it was never designed to provide. People speak about closure as though it were a destination that can be reached through a verdict or a sentence. Human experience is rarely so tidy. Grief does not operate according to legal timetables. Loss does not conclude when proceedings end. The people left behind continue carrying memories, absences, and questions long after public attention has moved elsewhere. Yet none of that diminishes the importance of accountability. If anything, it helps explain why accountability matters. Because when something irreversible has occurred, people often need reassurance that the harm has been recognised. rather than ignored. They need to know that responsibility has not disappeared into uncertainty. They need to know that what has happened has been seen. As the Yorkshire Ripper case moved steadily towards judgment, these realities existed together. The legal process could not restore what had been lost, but it could acknowledge it. It could examine the evidence. It could establish responsibility. And it could provide a public record of events that would endure long after the headlines had faded. That might not sound like enough. For many people, it never will. Yet perhaps there is something important in that acknowledgement. Because whilst justice cannot rewrite the past, it can refuse to look away from it. And sometimes, when confronted by extraordinary harm, that refusal matters more than we realise. As the case continued moving towards its next stage, it became increasingly apparent that accountability was not the only issue people were grappling with. There were also questions of understanding. At first glance, those questions may appear secondary. After all, the central facts of the case seemed increasingly clear. Peter Sutcliffe had been identified. Evidence was being examined. Investigators were building the case that would eventually move through the courts. Yet beneath those developments, a more complicated discussion was beginning to emerge. How should Peter Sutcliffe be understood? It is a deceptively simple question. People often assume that understanding and excusing are opposites. In reality, they can exist uncomfortably close to one another. Attempts to explain behaviour can sometimes feel as though they are reducing responsibility. Refusals to explore behaviour can sometimes leave important questions unanswered. Navigating the space between those two extremes is rarely easy. The closer people looked at Peter Sutcliffe, the more difficult that balance became. On one hand sat the extraordinary scale of violence, the years of fear, the lives lost, the survivors whose experiences would remain with them long after the investigation had concluded. On the other hand, sat a growing effort to understand the individual responsible, not to absolve him, not to justify him, but to answer a question that emerges repeatedly in cases like this. Why? Why these actions? Why this pattern of behaviour? Why this level of harm? Human beings are naturally drawn towards such questions. We seek explanation because explanation provides a sense of order. They help transform confusion into understanding. They allow us to place events within a framework that feels manageable. Yet there is also a danger hidden within that process. The more attention an offender receives, the easier it can become for the people they harm to fade into the background. That tension would continue shaping discussions surrounding Peter Sutcliffe as the case progressed. Because understanding an offender may be important, but it should never come at the expense of remembering those who paid the ultimate price for that understanding. As the legal process drew closer, society found itself attempting to hold both realities at the same time. The need to understand and the need to remember. Neither was simple. Both mattered. And before long, those competing demands would collide in ways that few people could have anticipated. The closer the case moved towards the courts, the more attention began turning towards a question that would shape much of what followed. Not whether Peter Sutcliffe had committed the attacks, but how his actions should be understood within the legal system itself. At first glance, that distinction may appear technical. In reality, it carried enormous significance. Legal systems do not simply determine whether events occurred. They also attempt to assess responsibility. They ask questions about intent, understanding, and accountability. They seek to establish not only what happened, but how those actions should be interpreted under the law. For many people following the Yorkshire Ripper case, these discussions felt uncomfortable from the very beginning. Years of violence had left little doubt about the scale of the harm that had occurred. Families had buried loved ones. Survivors had lived through horrific experiences that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Communities had spent years living beneath a shadow of fear and uncertainty. Against that backdrop, debates about explanation could sometimes feel difficult to tolerate. Yet those debates were unavoidable. Whenever serious violence occurs, societies are forced to confront questions that extend beyond the facts alone. People want to know what happened, but they also want to know why it happened. Those questions are not identical. One seeks evidence, the other seeks meaning. As Peter Sutcliffe's case progressed, these two searches increasingly began to overlap. The challenge, however, was that meaning is rarely straightforward. Human behaviour is complex. Motivations are complex. Explanations are complex. And whilst complexity can help people understand behaviour, it does not necessarily make that behaviour easier to accept. Perhaps that is why discussions surrounding responsibility often generate such strong reactions. People fear that explanation may become excuse. They worry that understanding may somehow diminish accountability. History repeatedly demonstrates that the relationship between those things is far more complicated. Understanding behaviour does not erase consequences. Exploring motives does not remove responsibility. And asking why something happened is not the same as suggesting it should be forgiven. As the Yorkshire Ripper case moved closer towards judgment, these distinctions would become increasingly important. Because, before long, the courts, the public, and the media would all find themselves wrestling with the very same difficult question. How should Peter Sutcliffe's actions be understood? And as events unfolded, not everybody would arrive at the same answer. Perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of judgment is that it asks people to look in two directions at once. On one hand, attention is directed towards the past. Evidence is examined. Decisions are scrutinised. Events are reconstructed in an effort to understand what happened and who was responsible. On the other hand, attention is drawn towards the future. What happens now? How do individuals, families, and communities move forward from something that cannot be undone? These questions rarely attract the same attention as investigations or trials. Yet they are often the questions that remain long after public interest begins to fade. For many people connected to the Yorkshire Ripper case, life had continued throughout the years of uncertainty. Children had grown older. Relationships had changed. New routines had emerged around losses that should never have existed in the first place. That is one of the quieter realities of grief. The world continues moving. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. Months become years. And somehow, people learn to carry things they never asked to carry, not because they want to, but because life leaves them little alternative. As discussions surrounding accountability continued, these realities remained present beneath the surface. Every debate about responsibility existed alongside lives that had already been altered. Every legal development existed alongside people learning how to navigate a future they never expected to face. Perhaps that is why judgment can feel so complicated. People often imagine it as a destination, a point at which questions are answered and uncertainty finally ends. In reality, it is often much quieter. A recognition, an acknowledgement, a moment in which society pauses long enough to say that what happened matters, that responsibility exists, and that the harm inflicted upon others should not be ignored. That recognition carries weight, but it does not carry people all the way home. The journey beyond judgment still belongs to those who must continue living with its consequences. And as the Yorkshire Ripper case moved steadily towards the next chapter, that reality remained impossible to escape. Some stories end with a verdict. The lives touched by those stories rarely do. As the Yorkshire Ripper case moved toward judgment, it became increasingly clear that no verdict could carry the weight people sometimes ask justice to bear. As we have already discussed, a court can establish responsibility. A sentence can impose consequences. The legal process could examine evidence, hear arguments, and reach conclusions. Yet there remain things beyond its reach. It could not return lost future. It could not restore interrupted lives. And it could not erase the years of fear, grief, and uncertainty that had shaped so many lives long before Peter Sutcliffe entered a courtroom. That reality is not unique to this case. It exists wherever serious harm occurs. Perhaps that is why people continue returning to stories like these decades later. Not because they are searching for a different verdict, but because they are searching for understanding. They are trying to understand how such events happen, how people respond to them, and what remains once the headlines fade and public attention moves elsewhere. For all the discussion surrounding Peter Sutcliffe, investigations, evidence, and accountability, the enduring legacy of this case has never belonged solely to the man responsible. It belongs to those whose lives were altered by his actions. The women who never returned home. The survivors who carried experiences that could never fully be put down. The families who learned to live alongside horrific absences. And the communities that spent years looking over their shoulders, waiting for uncertainty to end. Their stories do not begin or end with Peter Sutcliffe. They are larger than him. They are more important than him. And ultimately, they are the reason that this history continues to matter. Because judgment is not simply about deciding responsibility. It is about remembering what happened, remembering those who were harmed, and refusing to allow the people at the very centre of this story to disappear beneath the weight of everything surrounding them. As the case continued, the legal processes would continue, the questions would be debated, arguments would be made, and difficult decisions still lay ahead. Yet beneath all of it remained a truth that had been present from the very beginning. This story was never really about the man being judged. It was about the people who deserved better than the fate that they received. And it is with them that we should leave this chapter. In the next episode, we move deeper into the legal process itself. As the case progresses through the courts, questions of responsibility, accountability, and understanding become increasingly difficult to separate. Public attention intensifies. Arguments emerge about how Peter Sutcliffe should be understood, and the tension between explanation and accountability moves firmly into the spotlight. The search for Peter Sutcliffe may have ended. The debate surrounding his actions was only just beginning. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. And if you have a moment, a rating on Spotify or Audible really does help more people discover the podcast. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.